Hey guys, we are taking a look at the fourth branch of our government, which is also known as the bureaucracy. Now, there isn't really a fourth branch to the government. This is just a group that works underneath the president, but essentially does the work of all of the different branches. So, before we get into really breaking down what that means, I want you to take a look at this political cartoon. And I want you to see, what do we see straight up? Like, we know that we see the bureaucracy is the title. We see a flag waving in the background that says building permit. A man climbing over what looks like a bunch of walls saying which officer where. And then a office kind of down below that saying building permit next office, and another guy trying to climb out of that cubicle. Okay, so I want you to consider, what is the author trying to communicate in this political cartoon? Is he saying that the bureaucracy is really easy to navigate? Is he saying that it's really hard to get through? Okay, so consider this political cartoon, and we'll come back to it at the end of this presentation. So we're taking a look at the bureaucracy this week. This is a really interesting and slow branch to work through. So what even is the bureaucracy? So let's get started. Well, George Washington, who was our first president and the first elected Congress, created this system, which we know today, called the bureaucracy. Originally, it was made up of a cabinet of the old boys club. So essentially people that George Washington wanted around him who could implement policy. And it was a network of political allies. So people you could trust, people who would implement your wants and needs, things like that. But today, it's become a much larger political professional institution where instead of it being an old boys club of your friends and family, now today it's a group of experts, academics, and they're guiding the decision making of a lot of workers throughout the nation. It's not just in Washington, D.C. anymore either. Okay, so but most of the time we have our experts in different fields running our presidential cabinet positions, right? Like we've talked about before. So they're the heads of that field, most likely, whether it's like agriculture, education, infrastructure, things like that. And then they are going to filter down the information and policy to their workers in order to carry it out. So, like I said, this is sometimes referred to as the fourth branch of the government because they aren't quite the lawmakers, they aren't quite the president, and they aren't quite the judicial branch, but they are definitely making policy and carrying out that policy. So, the executive branch has employees down below them, right? We have our president, vice president, and our cabinet heads, but then all of the employees beneath those people who are the ones actually carrying out the different policies, this is what we call the bureaucracy. So they're the ones carrying out the tasks, carrying out the responsibilities that the government, the federal government, has come up with. This could include our post office workers, the IRS, who's dealing with our taxes in the spring, and it's about 441 agencies in total, and roughly only 10% of those people actually live in DC, right? Not every post worker that we know is living in DC and then delivering your mail every single day. No, the post workers live in our communities, and then they are actually federal workers. Same with a lot of different branches, Social Security offices, things like that. Those people live in our communities, but they are essentially a part of this bureaucracy. So the bureaucratic workers carry out the presidential agenda and any congressional laws or mandates that are typically going to be funneled down to them. Now, take for example, if Congress passes the ADA, which is a act called the Americans with Disabilities Act, it's not Congress who is actually going and enforcing that law. No, they're going to expect the executive branch to enforce the laws that they've made, But again, the president and vice president, they have a lot of different roles going on. So they're going to delegate it down to the health and human services sector in order to go make sure that the ADA Act is being complied with in all of the different nations. So that's just one example of how we kind of see Congress, the president, and then all of these bureaucratic workers playing a role. So again, ADA is a really important thing that is seen throughout all of the states. You have to comply to this act in order to ensure that people with disabilities have equal access to amenities such as like drinking fountains, bathrooms, ramps, elevators, things like that. So departments, these agencies, different commissions that might have been created by Congress, they are going to be run by both the executive branch and the legislative branch. So it puts them in kind of this gray area underneath the federal government, which is why we call them this fourth branch. They don't really fit into, again, the judicial, executive, legislative branch. So they are going to have what's called discretionary authority. This is that gray area that I just talked about. The bureaucratic agencies are actually able to write and enforce regulations. So take, for example, the Department of Education. Betsy DeVos, who is still our current Secretary of Education in early January of 2020, she is able to create the regulation that all states must provide standardized testing, okay, in your public schools. So all public schools have to give standardized testing. And then if you don't get federal money towards schools. Now, Congress didn't make that rule, and the president didn't make that rule, but the Department of Education did. So they made that discretionary authority to release that release that piece of kind of legislation, and then enforce it through the use of money. So they can issue fines, like if you're a building that is not compliant to the Americans with Disabilities Act, say you don't have an elevator and you have a second floor, say you don't have a handicapped stall in a bathroom, you can get fined for not complying to those things. And it's going to be a bureaucrat, someone from an agency within the executive branch who's going to come in and take a look at those things. We also see that members of the bureaucracy are going to come in and testify before Congress, which is a little bit of a unique thing because not a whole lot of people go in and testify before Congress. Okay, but Congress is the one that is creating these departments, and then they're going to be defining their goals, their mission. So we start to see a little bit of how Congress's hand is playing a role in that bureaucracy. But most of the time, they're going to leave that legislation pretty vague and let the bureaucracy define it out more. Okay, so if they said that states needed to have standardized testing to get funding, it may be up to the Department of Education to determine what does standardized testing look like, how do states submit that data, all of the little details that really come along with passing legislation. That's going to be up to the bureaucratic agencies in order to determine how is that data gathered, how is then federal funding handed out to different states. They're the ones that are the small guys working out all those details. Now, we call this, again, the fourth branch, and it's kind of tied between the president and Congress. So both Congress and the president have shared authority over these different agencies. On the president's side, they're going to guide all of the ideology. So they're going to say, yes, focus on implementing this. No, we're not going to enforce this kind of policy anymore. And that's totally coming from the top down. Okay, and that's usually when we hear about the president's agenda, different topics like that coming out in the news. And then states are able to determine, are we going to focus on this, or are we going to let things slide so we can focus on other things? This is something we call oversight. Okay, so presidential oversight or executive oversight. And again, that's just, passing down that agenda, saying here's what we're going to work on, here's what we're going to let slip for this year. And it ends up kind of into this red tape zone where we have conflicting or complex rules. Because obviously, we don't always have the same president for decades at a time, right? We have term limits for our presidents. And so when new people come in, there are new agendas. Or maybe there's a flip in party and there's different party agendas. And so the way that rules are implemented change. Could be from year to year or from administration to administration. And it is really confusing sometimes when it comes to governmental agencies, government entities, and trying to figure out, are we still following this law? Are we not? How do we file the paperwork for all of this? And this is what we call red tape. Okay, that's going to be a term you're going to want to remember because it's going to come up when we talk about, the bureaucracy. Is thinking back to this first, let's go all the way back to our first political cartoon, red tape, where there's so many hoops to jump through. There's so many people that have to check a box in order to make a decision made or have funding funneled down to the right person. And it ends up being so convoluted and so confusing for states or individuals to work through that the bureaucracy is known for being very slow and very hard to work with. Which brings us back again to this political cartoon, which is exactly what the author was trying to get across, is this guy's just trying to get a building permit, but he's jumping through all of these different boxes in order to do what seems like a really simple task, but in the end ends up being really confusing. Okay, so that's what red tape is, and that term is going to be associated with the bureaucracy a lot of time. Okay, so the bureaucracy is known for having a lot of paperwork, being slow, and being really complex. So let's go back to our slide. All right, so while the president and the executive branch have control over these bureaucratic agencies, Congress also has power of the purse, and they can request for a hearing at committee meetings, meaning that, again, there's this oversight and power from Congress over these different agencies. Now, again, because they have the power of the purse, which is a really influential power of Congress, they control all of the funding that's going to go into each bureaucratic agency, and they can kind of control the political support for different aid programs. Like, they can pass a law in order to allocate more funding towards the Americans with Disabilities Act, or they can choose something else. And it totally depends on Congress on whether that executive branch agency is going to get funding or not. So we call this the iron triangle, where there is a three-way relationship between Congress, an interest group, and an executive agency. Okay? So most of the times, interest groups are going to be involved with carrying out all of the different policies that have been implemented from Congress. Okay, so when we take a look at this iron triangle, I actually want you to pause the video right here and write down this graphic that you see here on the right. Okay, so pause the video, please. Copy this down in your notes, take a screenshot of it, do whatever you need to do. In an iron triangle, we see here this weird relationship between Congress, the bureaucracy, and interest groups. Okay, so Congress, again, we see are giving the funding and the political support towards a bureaucratic agency. Now, on the other hand, interest groups, we've talked about them before a little bit when we were looking at legislation. Interest groups are able to provide electoral support towards Congress. So take, for example, the NAACP. They are an interest group. They could use the money that they get from their members in order to help a specific person's campaign. Okay, so an interest group giving that electoral support to Congress. Congress is then giving that funding and political support then to a bureaucratic agency. Now, the bureaucratic agency could also then give special favors back into that interest group. Okay, here's another example. The NRA. Okay, so the NRA, the National Rifle Association, is an interest group. They could provide money in campaign support to a specific person or a group of people that are getting elected into Congress. So once those people are in Congress, they're going to support funding and political support towards a bureaucratic agency. Now, that bureaucratic agency, like the ATF, they may not enforce as much towards gun regulation as they would have before because of this triangle kind of support that is happening here on the red lines. Okay? Now, on the opposite side, the bureaucracy is going to look back at Congress and say, yeah, we'll support what you guys have put into law, or we'll loosely support it, we'll see how we feel. Okay, that is totally within the bureaucracy's power to loosely enforce or heavily enforce a law that has been passed. Now, Congress can then pass legislation in order to help an interest group. And then the interest group is going to help support the issues that the bureaucracy is dealing with. Okay, so again, let's take, for example, the NRA. Say that the NRA is going to be lobbying, they're going to be sending out articles, reaching out to their members, saying, let's support the ATF, they're doing a lot for us. The ATF can then look at Congress and say, hey, we'll support any policy that you pass for firearm safety. Or we support any legislation that you pass in order to help this type of ammo. Well, then Congress can then pass that specific type of legislation in order to go back and help the NRA. So in a way, they are both helping each other, all three are helping each other one way or another. Okay, so on one side, people say like, yeah, this is actually a really good thing because it goes back to that idea that we've seen already throughout this course of factions, where we have more than just one person or one group of people who are looking at a piece of legislation and deciding, is this a good law, is this a bad law, and then getting involved with it. So we like having a lot of different hands involved in the legislative process, like Congress, bureaucracy, interest groups. But on the other side, some people call this an undemocratic system because we have interest groups in a bureaucracy deciding how legislation is made, and these people aren't elected in at all. So people that we haven't elected are the ones that are making decisions on rules, regulations, laws, money even. Okay, so pros and cons to that iron triangle. But again, this is something that you guys are definitely going to want to keep in mind. You're going to see it for sure on my tests, wink wink, and as well as on the big AP test. Okay, I will provide a link to this video below, but if you aren't interested in waiting to see what's attached to the assignment, feel free to click on this link. It is about the iron triangle in more depth. So let's go over some of the laws that are really important when we are looking at the bureaucracy. And we've seen quite a few of these in the media this year, as the role between campaigning and workers is getting very blurred. The first is the Pendleton Civil Service Act. This was started in 1883, where it created a merit-based test for any job applicants. So think of it this way. You're taking the SAT, and the score that you get on the SAT determines if you can get a federal executive branch position. Now, the intention behind this law was that it would get rid of people nominating or allowing people into the executive branch based on favors or money contributions, family relations, things like that. Next, we have the Civil Service Commission. And this is the law that federal employees can't be required to contribute to political campaigns. So, say a president is running for re-election, that person can't require any of their lower staff to contribute to their political campaign. Okay, so that is completely illegal. President Trump, President-elect Biden are not allowed to ask their staffers to pay money towards a campaign for re-election. Okay, completely illegal. It is up to the individual to decide how to use personal money that they have earned through working in order to determine political contributions. And finally, we have the Hatch Act. This has been trending on Twitter quite a bit in the year of 2020. This is the law that says federal workers are not allowed to be directly involved in political campaigning. So the Hatch Act is a little bit interesting because it's gone through a little bit of an evolution. When the Hatch Act was originally created and passed, if you were an executive worker or a federal worker in any single way, you were not allowed to campaign, like at all. Whether that be for president, Congress, anything like that, you were not allowed to campaign. Today, it's more evolved to the point where you aren't allowed to campaign while you're on the job. So we could think of it this way. I am not allowed to stand in front of you and say, you need to vote for so-and-so. Completely illegal. However, when I'm outside of the classroom, outside of the school, no longer in any way associated with the school at all, I can go out and campaign for a person because it's my time, my money, things like that. Okay, so the Hatch Act is something that will probably come up again in when we're talking about later on down the road campaigns, finance, things like that. But it's a policy that is really under scrutiny this year, and I highly recommend that you guys kind of take a look at the gray area, which is 2020 with campaigns as far as the Hatch Act. So let's take a look at some of the examples of how we see the bureaucracy evolve over time. Obviously, as administrations change from party to party or person to person, the way that laws are interpreted are much different. Okay, so like I said, policy is going to be interpreted differently from person to person, party to party, year to year, even as more information comes about or different ideology, all of those things. It's going to change how we look at a specific law or how we place relevance or importance on a specific policy. So let's take a look at the Dreamers Act. This is something that we see in the media quite a bit, and it has to do with taking a look at undocumented immigrants here in the United States. So the Dreamers Act stands for the Development, Relief, and Education of Alien Minors. Now, during the Obama era, okay, so which was from 2008, 2016, Obama passed this legislation as an executive order. Okay, so he passed the Dreamers Act and said, I'm not going to deport any minor who did not have control over illegally coming into the United States. And so those individuals still have access to an education at public schools, things like that. Once the administration changed in 2016, the understanding that we are going to start going after these minors who are undocumented, things like that, we're going to start deporting these people, came into policy. And so the Dreamers Act came under scrutiny. It actually ended up even going to the Supreme Court, and it's still an issue of the bureaucracy today that kind of flip-flops back and forth between immigrants, undocumented, documented, and then minors. How do we deal with minors? Who did they have control? Did they not have control? And how do we treat them within society? And what do they have access to as far as legal access? Okay, so that's something that you're going to see change over the years. You know, it started back in 2009, 2008 era, and it's going to be a policy that you're going to see in the media probably for the next 15 to 20 years. Okay, it's always been something that comes up within campaign debates, things like that. Okay, another example is the issue of drugs. Now, this has been something within the last couple decades, states versus federal government, and how we go about with prosecuting drug use and drug distribution, all of that. It's really been changing back and forth. So in 2013, the Attorney General at the time, Eric Holder, said that he was going to not crack down on states that legalized marijuana. So if a state legalized, they had to handle it, and the federal government probably wouldn't deal with it much until later on. Whereas more recently, the former Attorney General Jeff Sessions, who was underneath the Trump administration, did say, we're going to again let local departments determine how marijuana policy is handled, and we really don't want the federal government to get involved with that. Okay, so even more recently, we've had a couple of states start to delegalize even what we consider harder drugs. And some states are still cracking down and saying, nope, we don't even want marijuana to be legalized, things like that. So it's up to the state levels right now, but the federal government, these bureaucratic agencies can decide, are we really going to crack down on this current federal law, or are we going to more let it slide and let states do their own things? All right, so that's all I have for you guys today. As always, reach out if you have questions. Recommend taking a look at that YouTube video, and definitely make sure that you have that iron triangle imagery down somewhere in your notes or somewhere on your computer. See you guys later.